defective product. The Adsonite stood like a statue, his large faceted eyes shimmering with all the colors of the rainbow, bright and meaningless. He did not seem to pay any attention to the various objects and tablets before him, though his antennae, which grew from the sloping forehead above his eyes, twitched slightly. It had been suggested that these twitches might be a sign of intense contemplation, but Sven was ready to swear that the Adsonite was simply sleeping, standing up, or meditating, or praying, mistaking him, Sven, for an unknown deity or demon, and the standard contactor's kit for magical artifacts, the trappings of a supernatural being. There was no way to find out, as the Adsonites stubbornly refused to make contact. The expedition had been working on the planet called Adson's World for a month, and for the last 2 weeks, Sven had been trying to make contact with the local population, all to no avail. It was getting desperate. Sven had been on 5 expeditions already, and never once had he encountered natives so indifferent to visiting alien beings. Hell, he'd prefer to see the Adsonites try to kill him regularly, as the amphibians from Vorian 4 had done, just to avoid banging his head against this wall. That said, the Adsonites were undoubtedly intelligent. Moreover, they had created a unique civilization, unlike anything humans had met. Most of them lived in living cities, huge, beautiful settlements where the dwellings were specially grown trees with big cavities. There were underground farms where various edible plants and local analogs of mushrooms grew, some sort of public buildings of unknown purpose, in which Adsonites gathered by the thousands, making strange sounds. Presumably, it was speech, which, however, even the most powerful linguistic computer of the expedition could not decipher. There was even a unique waste disposal system, small creatures of several types that absorbed any garbage and, in turn, served as an additional food source for the Adsonites. Sven couldn't remember which expedition member had first compared the Adsonites to ants and their city to an anthill, but in any case, the comparison was incorrect. First, the Adsonites were not insects. Biologists have yet to manage to get the body of an Adsonite for dissection, because the corpses of the dead went for processing in the same way as other waste. However, the appearance of the Adsonites was quite humanoid. The only features that related them to insects were huge faceted eyes and antennae above them, similar to the pinnate tendrils of butterflies. In addition, the Adsonites were divided into 2 sexes. They formed nuclear families, although children of a certain age lived in separate dormitories up to when they got families of their own. But the Adsonites ignored all attempts to establish contact. They had very little interest in what was happening outside the living cities and rarely went out. At one time, it seemed that they were interested in the new camp of scientists and regularly visited it to observe people. But in the end, it turned out that, due to ignorance, the camp was set up right on the way from one living city to another. Adsonites traveled very rarely, but when it did happen, and they came across a human camp, they showed a reaction unusual for an intelligent creature. They dumbly hovered in place, looking at the camp bustle, as if hypnotized by the alien life, and after a few hours turned around and went back to the city. To the shame of all scientists, this supposedly mysterious meditation was solved by the expedition's quartermaster, Caleb Suarez, a man as far from science as possible on a research ship. He simply drew a straight line on the map from the city to the camp, continued it, and cleared this continuation of all buildings and objects, and the Adsonites, as if nothing had happened, went straight through the camp, paying no attention to people or equipment and machinery. In a way, it was convenient. To initiate another contact attempt, Sven could simply stand in the path of another Adsonite walker. The aborigine would obediently stop, and the next phase of fruitless search would begin. Sven adjusted the filters in his nostrils and looked at the Adsonite with irritation. For a moment, he even envied the alien's equanimity. Adsonite was living his incomprehensible life and didn't care about anything. No allergies or worries about strange men from the stars. Adson was a planet of flowers and lush vegetation, the advantages of biological civilization. If you adjust to nature and adjust it to yourself without trying to rape it, you end up with a garden planet. Except that for a person with hay fever, this planet suddenly turns out to be a source of torment. No predators, no dangerous microorganisms, the purest air, saturated with floral aromas. And he has to live with plugs in his nose because there are clouds of damn pollen everywhere. Time to let the Adsonite go. It's all useless. Time to let the Adsonite go. It's all useless. Sven began to gather his accessories, and as soon as the way was free, the Adsonite immediately stirred, his antennae stood up straight, and he, as if there was no 2-hour break, walked to Paris, as the expedition members jokingly dubbed one of the nearest living cities. The second city, one of the biggest on the planet, became Beijing. From Beijing to Paris, on foot, in 3 days. It would be funny if it weren't so sad. Sven was determined to convince the head of the expedition, Captain Pokrovsky, to allow him to settle in one of the cities. Of course, this went against all safety rules and psychological principles of contact, but it was clear to Sven that this was the only opportunity he had left. Only if he was among the natives, in their natural habitat, would he have any hope of understanding and chance to establish some semblance of contact. Sven mentally prepared a heartfelt speech in his defense, referencing the experience of the Villas-Boas brothers in South America and Chong Zim on the Sulpician planet. However, such a request must be made in person, and the captain has now left for the South mainland to investigate some unusual volcanic activity. The petition would have to wait until tomorrow. The next day, however, something happened that made Sven's plans meaningless, something that catastrophically disrupted the soporific and monotonous life of the base research camp on a safe, as it seemed to everyone, planet. The deputy head of the geological sector, Shandor Valtos, had disappeared. He worked mainly in the camp, processing data and samples brought in by field staff from all over the planet, and he hardly ever left the perimeter, so his absence was immediately noticed. It was also discovered that the single-seat ATV, for short trips within a few kilometers of the camp, where the density of vegetation allowed, was missing. Shandor was not in contact. His personal sensor had been disabled. However, the ATV's beacon showed the vehicle's location about 30 kilometers east of the camp, away from the known Adsonite settlements. The visual search from the orbit using the powerful optics of the mission's mothership gave nothing. The vegetation was too dense. Nobody has the slightest idea what the hell Shandor could do there. Captain Pokrovsky took a large shuttle and personally went to search for the missing scientist. After several hours of intensive search, they found him 3 clicks away from the ATV, hopelessly bogged in a shallow swamp, in the ruins of an abandoned city of Adsonites, which no one would call a living city now. All the houses, plants in it had long since died and turned into dry wood. More precisely, they found a body badly eaten by feral scavengers. The geologist was dead. The autopsy showed that Shandor died before the scavengers got to him, Pokrovsky said. The cause of death has not yet been determined. So far, nothing seems to indicate that it might be violent. Still, I'm forced to cancel all outside missions and set up a protective perimeter with the passive force field. He held up a hand, reassuring the scientists, and a worried whisper ran through the ranks. I understand your concerns. Everyone has their research program to work on, but the death of an expedition member is a serious issue, and it imposes additional risks on me. Until the clarification of all circumstances, I am forced to resort to emergency security measures. Questions? The people were stunned and silent. Sven waited a moment longer, then raised his hand. Pokrovsky nodded to him. What do you have, Tomberg? Sven stood up, feeling awkward in the center of everyone's attention. What about the Adsonites? He said. We happen to be camped right on their road between the cities. A defensive barrier will block their path. The captain was silent for a moment, thinking. I understand your concern, he repeated at last. I'm aware of the story about moving the equipment, but we don't have time to move the camp. They'll have to wait a while or go around. I'm sure the natives had nothing to do with Shandor's death, but I can't risk it until we're 100% sure. If that's all, this meeting is adjourned. The captain waited a moment, then said in a lower tone, check all the data you've gathered up until today and see if there are any clues. We have to find out what happened. For a few days afterward, the people gradually got used to life in lockdown. Although the camp was spacious enough, it was hard to get used to the idea of not being able to leave the camp at will. At the same time, the Adsonites were also confronting the fact that they could no longer go wherever they wanted. But unlike humans, they were taking it much worse. Or rather, they couldn't take it at all. They simply came to an invisible protective force field, literally poked their foreheads into the elastic barrier, and stopped. After tramping on the place for several hours, the most stubborn stayed at the camp border for almost the whole local day. The natives turned around and left the same way they had come. Sometimes, there were several of them at once, and some in the camp complained that they felt uncomfortable under the gaze of the big dragonfly eyes. Sven noticed that all the walkers were male. The female Adsonites were usually shorter in stature and of a noticeably more subtle build, much like humans, though no particular sex characteristics were visible. The Adsonites did not wear clothing, much to the delight of biologists who could at least visually study the anatomy of the natives. Despite their insectoid appearance, they were not insects, nor could they be called mammals. Although Adsonite women became pregnant and bore children, they had no mammary glands. The processes of conception and nurturing of the young were still a mystery. Most likely, the Earth classification did not apply to the local species. Sven had no doubt that biologists would develop a new one when they thoroughly understood everything. The investigation into the cause of the geologist's death had not yet yielded definite results. Analyses of tissue samples showed that his central nervous system, including the brain, was severely damaged, and it was this damage that eventually caused his death. But what caused it could not yet be established. If it was some kind of toxin, it had already decayed, and it was impossible to reconstruct it from the decay products. If it was some kind of ionizing radiation, its effect was very selective, and, most importantly, what could be the source? The purely biological civilization of the Adsonites, for all its intricacy, was hardly capable of creating something as technologically advanced as an X-ray machine or a laser. Meanwhile, the humans had gradually gotten used to having a few Adsonites hanging around the southern edge of the camp. Even Sven, who at first tried to take advantage of the situation and work with several natives at once, eventually gave up on this idea and started studying the material filmed by automatic probes in the living cities, hoping to find some new keys to the understanding of this strange civilization. Of course, the filming had been done as discreetly as possible to not disturb the natives, although now he doubted that the game was worth the candle. In Sven's opinion, the Adsonites didn't care about anything in the world. If only he had known in advance how everything would turn out, he would have driven a few micro-drones into the holy of holies of the natives, the meeting halls, kindergartens, and maternity hospitals. For now, however, the captain had ordered that all surveillance equipment be returned to the camp until further notice. On the sixth day, Sven glanced at the parking lot, as everyone now called the part of the perimeter where the unlucky walkers congregated, and noticed something unusual was happening there. Instead of the usual loitering, the Adsonites were busy doing some kind of work. When Sven got closer, he saw that they were digging small holes with primitive shovels and planting something in the fresh soil. Sven looked closer and quickly recognized the young house trees that made up the living cities. The shape of their leaves and the characteristic texture and color of their bark were unmistakable. In addition, he noticed that one of the Adsonites looked familiar. It was a tall male with a prominent scar on the left side of his head that went over the faceted eye, causing some of the eye cells to lose their iridescent glow and become cloudy. Sven was ready to swear that this Adsonite had been here yesterday and the day before. The Adsonites were building their camp. Half an hour later, he shared this information with the head of the mission. "That's interesting," Pokrovsky said, looking at the fresh plantation just beyond the invisible defense barrier. "Didn't you tell me not so long ago that the natives are completely devoid of curiosity? It seems you were wrong. I can't explain it any other way than by setting up an observation post. When it comes to extraterrestrial civilization, you should never jump to conclusions," said Sven. "Remember how wrong we were about the Sulpadians. Some of us almost thought they were in a war of extermination and wanted to intervene. We almost nuked the World Festival of Generations. But now I might even agree with you." The captain rubbed his forehead tiredly. "The headache is killing me. Can't sleep for 2 nights, nightmares and crap. We must do something about the investigation or shut down the program. We can't go on like this. Everyone's tired. As for you..." He thought for a moment. "I feel fine," Sven said. "That's not what I mean." The captain smiled. "I'm glad to hear it, though. All the more reason for you to try to compare the map of the dead city where Shandor was found with the schematics of the Adsonite cities we know. You're the best at this. See if you can figure out where the poor guy was trying to get to. Maybe you can find any parallels. If we can figure out where he was going, it might shed some light on why he did it. And keep one eye on these." The captain nodded toward the barrier. "They're not likely to represent any danger to us, but after Shandor, I'd rather not take any chances." Sven spent the rest of the day studying the scans of the various Adsonite cities. The largest, he estimated, had up to 200,000 inhabitants, the smallest about 10,000. The images varied. Some had been taken from orbit, others from the shuttle during long-range sorties, and several surrounding cities, most notably Beijing and Paris, had been especially carefully captured by autonomous and teleoperated drones. In the process, he had become definitively convinced of a startling fact. The Adsonites don't have any infrastructure outside the cities. They had no agriculture, small out-of-town settlements, or even regular transportation or trade links between cities. Only rare solitary walkers trample through barely visible, quickly overgrown paths in the forests and fields. Nothing even remotely resembling roads, and that was doubly surprising. How had Shandor been able to unmistakably determine the direction to the abandoned city of the Adsonites, which, until that moment, none of the humans had any idea about? In addition, he discovered another thing that he had not paid much attention to before. The Adsonite cities, despite their complexity and harmony, were completely different. Of course, due to the fact that the live houses consisted of plants of the same species, they had a certain similarity to each other, but the layout of each city was unique. Some cities were clearly drawn to symmetry, though rather distorted. It could be both central and axial. And some were completely chaotic, at least at first glance. Some cities had strict geometric outlines, usually of a reasonably precise circle, while others were shapeless. Sven found no system in this. It could be a sign of anything: artistic inclinations of the inhabitants, religious symbols of various cults, fashion for different styles of urban architecture. Only the Adsonites knew the answer, but they were obviously not inclined to share the details of their cultural life. Speaking of the natives, Sven glanced at the screen that displayed the image from the camera he'd set up in front of their new bed of arboreal saplings. Most of the Adsonites had disappeared, probably gone home. Only 2 figures were daubing at the fancy plants. In the twilight, the details were no longer discernible. The Adsonites stood almost out of reach of the camp light, but somehow Sven was sure that one of them was the old acquaintance with the scar. The exo-psychologist wanted to watch another recording, this time a recent video by a drone monitoring Beijing. However, after delving into the video for only 10 minutes, he realized his eyes were slipping from fatigue. Something he had seen was trying to grab his attention, but he resolutely told himself, "It can wait until tomorrow," and went to sleep. It had been a sweltering night. After barely a couple of hours of sleep, Sven woke up feeling short of breath. He got up, drank some water, and changed the filters to a lighter version that offered less protection from anything that might be in the air, but let in a lot more of it. He wouldn't die of allergies before morning, but it would be difficult to sleep without oxygen. He fell into a deep sleep and didn't wake up until morning. Waking up, he felt vaguely uneasy, though he didn't remember his dream. The captain was right. They were all very tired. Sven couldn't wait to get back to work, so without leaving his dome, he had a quick bite of the dinner he had brought from the mess hall yesterday, drank some cold tea from the thermos, and turned on the work terminal. He picked the record on which he had fallen asleep yesterday and began to look through it carefully, trying to catch what scratched his sleepy brain. It was a panorama of Beijing from a bird's eye view, and as the image got closer, the frame was fixed on one Adsonite who looked a little different from the others. Sven took a closer look. That's right, the Adsonite's arm was severely mangled, and he was also visibly hobbling on one leg. Fell into a hole? Crushed by a fallen tree? There were no dangerous predators on the planet, at least none that could threaten the natives, and no one had ever seen a fight or anything that could be taken for a conflict between the Adsonites. It was surprising, and gave rise to many extraordinary hypotheses. Obviously, the fact that any of the Adsonites could have been injured so seriously at all had caught the exo-psychologist's attention yesterday. Sven continued to follow the maimed native. The Adsonite walked down the winding street and entered a sizable, roofless structure that Sven had long ago dubbed a stadium, for lack of a better name, even though there were no tribunes in it. It was just a large, irregularly circular space bounded by the high walls of the treehouse. Suddenly, Sven was struck by a hunch. He paused the recording and opened the still images of the dead city in which Shandor had been found. The city was rampant with wild vegetation, and the outline was hard to make out, but it was still apparent that Shandor's body had been found in the very center of the very similar-looking stadium. Anticipating bad things, Sven reran the first recording and saw the crippled Adsonite step into the middle of the stadium and stop. Not a minute later, the ground around him stirred, and the scavengers came to the surface one by one, forming a ring around the native. The Adsonite sat down, bowing his head, and a moment later, all the scavengers pounced on him, instantly hiding him under a moving cover of bodies. After a couple of dozen seconds, it was all over. The scavengers scattered in different directions. Some slipped back into their holes, and others made their way out into the city streets through several different entrances of the stadium. Only a damp patch of orange, blood-soaked soil remained where the crippled Adsonite had just sat. Sven stared, mesmerized, for a while, not noticing the image on the screen. Then he jumped up, knocking over his chair, and rushed out of the dome. He must notify the captain immediately. He was greeted by a completely empty, extinct camp. The residential domes, research facilities, the command center, the mess hall, everything was deserted. Sven's gaze wandered to the landing pad. Thank God, both shuttles and small flyers were parked where they should be, and even the ATVs seemed to be in place. So, the people had left on foot. Or had they been kidnapped? No, he thought, it's impossible. The Adsonites had never shown the slightest sign of aggression. In the case of an extraterrestrial civilization, one should never jump to conclusions. Damn. But how could they have gotten into the camp? No living creature could pass through the barrier except those whose genetic code the protective field was tuned to. Sven looked toward the Adsonites' makeshift observation post. The seedlings were in place, but the natives were gone. The vegetation in the area was mussed and broken, and the tracks clearly went deep into the jungle toward Beijing, so the people went that way, just like Shandor. His head was splitting with pain. He must go after them immediately. He must hurry, catch up with everyone. He can't stay here alone. Sven staggered towards the barrier, but realized that he couldn't go anywhere in his condition. His eyes were watering desperately, and the skin on his face and hands itched unbearably. Christ, he'd forgotten to put in the regular filters. Allergy. Sven returned to his dome and, through the tears, with trembling hands, put the mask connected to the emergency tank over his face. The cylinder contained a clean air mixture laced with antihistamines. It was urgent to eliminate the symptoms. There was no time to waste. At the same time, he gave himself an injection of painkiller, and after a minute, he felt much better. To his surprise, along with the allergy symptoms and headache, the frantic desire to catch up with the other people had disappeared. Sven still felt an intense anxiety and desire to save his companions, but he was no longer tempted to chase after them immediately. Something was wrong. Allergies are unpleasant, but they don't affect the psyche. So it must be something else. And why is he suddenly calm? Painkillers and antihistamines can't have neuroleptic effects either, so that leaves… Wait, what does that leave? Air. Sven wasn't breathing filtered air now, but air from the tank. So there was something in the air. As soon as he isolated himself from the environment, the effects stopped. The scientist's inquisitive mind was already tearing itself loose, building one hypothesis after another. But that could wait. First of all, it was necessary to save the people, who, as Sven was now sure, were walking towards an imminent and terrible death. It was about 20 kilometers from Beijing. That meant almost a full day's walk through the local thickets, so he had to make it. Sven picked up the air tank and walked toward the big shuttle on the landing pad. He already knew what he was going to do. "It turns out your allergies saved us all," the captain said with a slight smile. Who would have thought that such a pesky thing as a tendency to allergies could be a lifeline? They were sitting in the captain's quarters aboard the Lavoisier, comfortably seated in soft chairs near a table on which stood a bottle of light Aldebaran wine from the captain's personal supplies. On the large wall screen was an image of the abandoned camp on Adson, a live feed from an automatic camera mounted on the radar mast. The camp was already beginning to slowly overgrow with native vegetation, with the arboreal saplings on the southern edge growing noticeably taller and sprouting lateral shoots. Soon, there would be a new town on the site of the camp, and the new residents. Sven and the captain followed the lone Adsonite as it crossed the abandoned base. Still, it's more luck than anything else, Sven said. If I hadn't changed my filters to lighter ones overnight, I probably wouldn't have realized what was going on so quickly. And without understanding, I certainly wouldn't have been able to handle 24 people. You were already approaching Beijing when I caught up with you. I have almost nothing to tell you, said the captain thoughtfully. All I remember is that I had a typical nightmare, where you usually have to get somewhere, but you can't because your legs can barely walk. And then I woke up aboard the shuttle, tied up, and with the hell of a headache. Sven blushed. I'm sorry. I didn't know how quickly the pheromones would wear off, so I put power shackles on everyone in case you woke up too early. And the headache is from the sleeping gas. I overdosed a little. I was afraid it wouldn't work. Pokrovsky waved it off. Come on, it's all nonsense. After all, you saved everyone's life. That outscored everything. Now, I understand how you guessed about the external influence, but how did you know it was pheromones? Sven sipped the tart wine and put the glass back on the table. I didn't know that at first. I only realized it was something in the air, something my filters were only partially trapping, pollen, gas, or something else. At that moment, I didn't care about details. The main thing was to save people. I guessed about pheromones later, on the ship, when I dissected the body of an Adsonite killed by the gas. And it changed all our ideas about intelligent life on Adson, the captain said. Sven nodded. It sure did. We were looking in the wrong direction, and my attempts to make contact with the Adsonites. He laughed. Just imagine if some cybernetic intelligent race came to Earth and tried to make contact with our telephones, food processors, and vacuum cleaners. Of course, the analogy isn't entirely accurate, but it's as absurd as our situation on Adson. When it was discovered that the Adsonites have no brain but possess a very complex and advanced olfactory system, all the puzzle pieces fell into place. The captain switched the channel, and a picture of a living city appeared on the screen. Intelligent forests using mindless humanoids as symbiotes to serve them. No one had ever encountered anything even remotely similar until now. No wonder we went down the wrong path from the start. It's a shame it took poor Shandor's death to find a clue. I think the cities, the true intelligent inhabitants of Adson, mistook us for some kind of feral symbiote at first. Apparently, they weren't too interested, but then Shandor was exposed to the pheromones from the dead city. I guess part of the city was still alive, and by some unfortunate coincidence, it was the part responsible for disposing of the defective symbiotes. Some really unlucky wind brought this poisonous cloud that caught the geologist. In the end, we closed the camp with a barrier, and the communication between Beijing and Paris stopped, because the symbiotes can only walk along the pheromone path. They have nothing to make decisions with. In fact, the entire cavity of their head is occupied by one big nose, to put it very primitively. Well, the city, which we called Beijing, decided to dispose of all the defective symbiotes. That is us. The pheromones were too far away for direct exposure. They'd disperse on the way. So they stuck this seedbed right up to the camp, and we took it for an observation post, continued the captain. It was actually their pheromone version of a loudspeaker. It's a good thing that you were exposed to pheromones much less than Shandor, Sven said. The medics are hiding behind their reservations, but it looks like no one's nervous system or brain seems to have been affected. Maybe it's because Shandor was affected by the dead city. I don't know. To be honest, I still sometimes had bad dreams about the disposal of that crippled symbiote. If I'd been too late. All's well that ends well, the captain said, and we should probably thank the manufacturers of your filters. When we get back to Earth, I'll be sure to mention them in my report. That's what quality means. Sven suddenly laughed. After he calmed down and took a breath, he looked at the captain's bewildered face and said, "You see, there's a catch, sir. The advertisement and the manual for the filters say that this is a unique development of the manufacturer's company, a new word in making life easier for people prone to allergies. The filters stop only particles the size of plant pollen, something that usually causes allergies, and let in any odors and pheromones. As it said, you'll be able to enjoy the perfume and feelings of your loved ones without sneezing or wiping away tears." The captain stared at him. "It means that you—" "Exactly, sir. If we play by the rules, I should have sued the manufacturer." Sven finished his wine in a gulp. The filters didn't pass through the pheromones because they were defective. Abnormal startup. "That can't be right. Your equipment must be glitching again." Otto shook his head. "I'm telling you, I've double-checked it several times," he said. "The error is large, of course, which is not surprising with numbers like that. However, the orders of magnitude are the same for all measurements. This thing is at least 800 million years old, maybe even more." Sven shifted his gaze from the physicist to the temple, even apart from the incredible information he had been given. The building, if only it could be called that, was astonishing, and that was putting it mildly. The slightly sloping walls jutted upward, lost in the bluish haze in the agosphere sky, 7 kilometers high, 18 long, and 10 wide. Sven had seen pictures of it from orbit. The temple looked like a monstrously sized mashup of the Aztec pyramid and a neo-Gothic cathedral designed by a deranged artificial intelligence. But how could it have been preserved for so long? Sven patted his hand on the smooth, unbroken parapet of the outer ramp that led to the temple's main entrance. Both were on the same mind-boggling scale. The ramp was the width of 2 football fields, and the open rectangular opening of the entrance ended in a titanic crossbeam nearly half a kilometer high. Agosphere certainly has a very flat climate, but it couldn't have remained unchanged for nearly 1 billion years. That's simply impossible. Otto shrugged. "I can't say anything about the climate. Matson and his department are dealing with that. By the way, the atmosphere is not the only mystery. Have you ever wondered how it is that Agosphere has breathable air, even though life has been gone for God knows how many millions of years, if it ever existed?" "Indeed." Sven scratched his chin thoughtfully. The inviolable rule of no life, no oxygen obviously didn't work on this strange planet. Sven was delighted by the atmosphere's near-perfect sterility as a man prone to allergies, but somehow he had overlooked the obvious. Well, the presence of the temple clearly tells us that there was once life on Agosphere, and what life? No single structure is even remotely comparable in scale to the temple in all known space. The physicist squinted and looked at Sven. Jamal is certainly not as skilled a prospector as Shandor was, but he is an excellent geologist. Still, he hadn't found any signs of life in the pits. Quartz, basalt, volcanic sediment, anything but organics. Sven spread his hands. "Sorry, I'm not a paleontologist, but any artificial structures are more or less in the contact department. I hope there's no doubt that the temple is not a natural structure." "Yes, it's hard to mistake it for a fossilized plant," Otto smiled. "Although biologists would love it. They're going to get bed sores from idleness. Hopefully, they'll find something when the captain finally gives the go-ahead to explore the temple's interior." After the incident on the Adson's world, when because of an incredible coincidence of circumstances, the entire research party working on the surface almost got killed, the captain of the research ship, Lavoisier Sviatoslav Pokrovsky, became even more cautious than usual and categorically forbade anyone to even approach the temple closer than a few hundred meters. However, With the new information about the unimaginable age of the structure, hope loomed before Sven. If any dangers had once existed within the walls of this cyclopean structure, they would surely have been reduced to ashes in 1 billion years. Although, the temple itself had not turned to ashes, had it? There was only one way to find out. In the large dome, where a huge screen was broadcasting images from the remote control device Sven had borrowed from the biologists, almost all the personnel working on the planet's surface were gathered. Except for the temple and the oxygen atmosphere of mysterious origin, the second planet in the VGKC 483 system turned out to be boring and trivial, similar to Mars, sand, stones, and rocks from pole to pole. Agasphere was named so by the commander of the small scout, who discovered it 18 years ago. Interestingly, he somehow managed not to notice the temple, although the name seemed inspired by the analogy between the immortal biblical character and the age of the mysterious structure. The remote-controlled vehicle, a small tracked drone, had just arrived at a place that could conventionally be called the threshold of the temple. Because of the scale of the temple, there was no feeling for the observers that the drone was actually passing through a doorway. It was good that the unknown architect had decided to do without steps, and a sloping ramp several kilometers long led inside the temple. Considering that the entrance was 600 meters above the ground, Sven wouldn't have been surprised if each step was 60 meters high. The drone stopped for a few minutes, taking measurements. A bar of numbers ran to the right of the main camera image. Atmosphere, gravity, magnetic field. Everything was exactly the same as outside, anywhere on a gas sphere. The operator moved the control joysticks, and the drone slowly crept forward. Contrary to the expectations of some of the excited members of the expedition, except for the size, the interior of the temple was nothing special. No ancient mechanisms, mysterious alien cult objects, works of art, or alien skeletons and mummies. Just an enormous hall, paved with stone slabs and lit by massive pillars of light falling from holes in the roof. "There's hardly any dust," said someone in the audience. "Strange, isn't it? It's as if someone had vacuumed everything just before we arrived." Indeed, there was almost no dust, only a thin layer in which the drone left a well-defined trace. Even given that the planet had an incredibly flat climate, why was there no trace of wear and weathering in the temple in a few 100 million years? The interior of the temple, though gigantic, still clearly did not match the exterior dimensions of the building. The drone operator zoomed in on the main camera and slowly rotated it 360 degrees. Everyone saw rectangular openings in the side walls, similar to the entrance one, but 3 times smaller. Obviously, it was entrances to some secondary rooms or corridors. The operator looked at Captain Pokrovsky standing next to him. He nodded, and the operator took the drone to the nearest side entrance. Since it was more than 3 kilometers from the middle of the main hall to the target, it took quite a while to get there. The amazement at the scale of the internal structure of the temple gradually receded into the background. The drone rolled on the flat floor, leaving a smooth path in a thin layer of dust, but generally, there was nothing to look at. Only the monotonous gray walls rise to unimaginable heights. In fact, the internal architecture of the temple was straightforward and utilitarian, providing little ground for fantasy, except for the most critical question: who built this fantastic structure, and why? The mission members gathered in the dome were increasingly distracted from the screen. The room was filled with the noise of soft conversations, and some of those who had their own work to do eventually went to their labs, asking to be notified if anything unusual was found. Despite being the expedition's chief expert on alien civilizations, Sven thought he understood no more than anyone else. Even the definition of temple he had given to the building was pure convention. It is quite a human tradition. If you find some big building, the purpose of which you do not understand, the easiest way out is to call it a temple. Religion will tolerate everything. Although the building could be anything, people had always called any large structure a temple, especially if it was ancient. Sven looked at the screen again. Straight angles, gigantic stone blocks. Is it stone? Why no traces of erosion? A thin layer of dust. Why so thin? Suddenly, Sven felt a rush of intense irritation. For once, he had been lucky enough to stumble upon a unique artifact. But what he can get out of it? Just a colossal stone box without the slightest hint of who built it, when, and why. It's a shame when the rarest amazing find turns out to be boring beyond comprehension. In a few days, drones explored the temple up and down, and nothing unexpected was found in it. A giant central hall and several dozen smaller side halls. Along the two long walls were sloping ramps leading to the secondary halls of the second and third levels. The temple was built from a perfectly ordinary volcanic rock, similar to terrestrial basalt. There was no explanation yet as to why it remained untouched by erosion for hundreds of millions of years. However, it had become clear to everyone that the temple was essentially just a gigantic stone box. No ancient traps, artifacts, or anything like that. So Captain Pokrovsky finally gave the go-ahead for people to enter the building with maximum caution. Sven grinned. The term maximum caution sounded overly exciting. In fact, they simply drove several ATVs inside and split off in two batches in different directions. Otto and his two assistants wanted to take measurements at the temple's far wall. There was only one exit in the building, using the equipment they had loaded into two trailers. Sven and Noelani Akana from the biology department decided to drive through the side galleries all the way to the outermost hall of the upper level. "How did you convince the captain to let us use the ATVs?" Noelani asked. "Knowing his tendency to overreact, I was sure he'd send us on foot." They stopped at the beginning of the ramp. It was strange to realize that you'd been riding inside the vast building for a good 15 minutes, and you hadn't even gotten to the second floor yet. "Simple arithmetic," Sven smiled. "It's almost 20 kilometers from the entrance to this hall, from which you can go to the ramp and then the same distance to the second floor. If you travel by foot, it's a hike of several days, but you can do it in a few hours on ATVs. It's safer. I almost didn't even have to convince him." "Oh, I hadn't thought of that," Noelani said. "You're right. It's just that when you think about exploring a building, it doesn't occur that you'd be traveling dozens of kilometers." Sven looked up, where 1.5 kilometers above his head, the ceiling of the side gallery was lost in darkness. "Yes, I still can't get my head around how huge everything is here. Well, let's move on, shall we?" He started his ATV, and the sound of the engine echoing off the distant walls and ceiling came back to them from the darkness a few moments later with a rumbling roar. "Don't you think it's strange?" Noelani asked. "What, exactly?" Sven opened the large case he had taken out of the ATV's trunk and began to slowly and methodically mount the laser scanner on a tripod. The drone had its own scanner, but it was rather weak, and Sven wanted to get a model of the interior of the corner hall as detailed as possible. There were some anomalies in the remote's image, either artifacts or irregularities on the walls, and Sven wanted to see if there was anything useful concerning his specialty. Maybe he'd be lucky enough to find some inscriptions or images carved into the mysterious building material. All of it. Noelani was as methodically collecting dust samples from the floor, checking the coordinates on the tablet, where a hall plan was drawn and divided into neat squares. Someone, God knows how long ago, had built this gigantic thing and then disappeared without leaving the slightest hint of himself. Not a line, Not a letter, not a picture. Noelani put another cotton swab into a sealed tube, inserted it into a special box, then got on the ATV, drove 50 meters away, and repeated the procedure. She had already traveled at least a kilometer, so they were talking on the radio, but Sven could see the light from her headlights. 800 million years, he said. That's a long time. This temple, or whatever it is, was already standing when no organisms on Earth were more complex than sponges. How do we know there wasn't some time ago when the whole surface was painted and stenciled? I don't think so. The temple was so quiet that Sven could hear the tinkling of glass and the muffled rustle of Noelani's footsteps. There are no signs of erosion on the walls, so there is no reason for the image's disappearance. Complete disappearance, mind you. No remnants of paint, no evidence of carvings that once existed. It feels like the temple was built not 800 million, but 8 years ago. Yeah, I agree with you there. The earpiece clicked 3 times. Hold on, Noe. Otto's on the line. Sven changed the channel. What is it, Otto? He asked cheerfully. Have you found the solution to the great temple beyond time yet? The solution to the temple? Otto's voice had changed almost unrecognizably, becoming something creaky and shrill. Sven thought it was the excitement. The physicists must have found something interesting. The temple is nothing, Sven. We've found the solution to everything, our whole damn universe. I was only in the cell for 3 minutes and managed to... Otto suddenly stopped talking. Sven heard a noise as if something had fallen, then hoarse, heavy breathing, then Otto's voice again. But it was different. Shaken, full of terror, trembling. God, Sven. Huang, he's... Damn it, breathe. Breathe, my friend, please. Sven heard a rhythmic noise as if someone was running, working his arms in a measured motion, or performing the CPR. Shit. Otto was breathing hard. He was breathing very hard, with whistling and wheezing. Sven, I can't get communication with Lavoisier in the camp. Some kind of interference. He's bad, but he's still breathing. God, I'm affected too. And I've only been here a minute. Otto sobbed. But I've got to get Alan out. He's still in there. I don't know if I'm strong enough, but I must. Otto paused, catching his breath. Contact the camp and race here, in case we don't. Never mind. Whatever happens, don't go into the chamber. Under no circumstances. We'll be beyond help. And you. Beware of the wave. The comm went silent. Sven stared dazedly at Noelani's headlights moving in the distance until he realized she was calling him relentlessly and changed the channel. Something's up with the physicists, he said, ahead of any questions. Quit what you're doing and come back. We have to figure out what to do. Suddenly the warm light of the headlights that cut through the darkness of the temple seemed to him very weak, small, and helpless. Like themselves, microscopic bugs on a giant stone tank floor, unexpectedly turning from mysterious to incomprehensibly dangerous. They were unable to reach the camp on comms. There was only faint white noise on all channels, not even a hint of a signal getting through, even though Noelani and Sven could communicate with each other without problem. The physicists were no longer in contact, and given Otto's last words, Sven had the darkest premonitions about the reasons for their silence. Emotionally, Sven was eager to go to the place where something terrible had happened to his colleagues, but he understood that it was necessary to inform the others. First of all, Captain Pokrovsky, because people in the base camp and on the ship still had no idea that something unforeseen had happened in the temple. However, it took a lot of work to persuade Noelani. You go to the camp if you need to, she said. I want to help Otto. Sven had a strong suspicion that neither Otto nor the other 2 physicists needed help anymore, but he didn't want to use such a terrible argument with the girl. He had to come at it from the other side. Whatever happened, it's almost certainly connected with the temple, he said. That means with the alien structure. If anyone in this mission knows how to work with aliens or their artifacts, it's me. And we should definitely notify Pokrovsky to organize a rescue. All right, she said at last. You got it. You just keep in touch while comms are working. And be careful, okay? And before Sven could answer, she was speeding her ATV for the exit of the temple. Okay, he answered into the communicator, suddenly feeling incredibly lonely in the monstrous interior of the temple, filled with still darkness that now seemed imbued with unknown danger. He had seen the place where the physicists were working from a distance. Otto approached the matter with his usual thoroughness. The physicists had set up good lighting from several spotlights connected to a generator, a fieldwork table, and equipment racks nearby. Sven saw all of this from a distance, and when he got closer, he noticed another detail he would rather not have seen. A man lying next to the table in a bright spot of light. Sven swallowed and cranked the throttle to full blast. Noelani had lost contact with him a few minutes ago when the girl had driven outside the temple. Well, perhaps it was for the best. He wouldn't have to tell her that Thi Hoang, a junior member of the physics department and a great comedian, a favorite of the entire expedition, was dead. Hoang looked so different that Sven could hardly recognize him. A thin, bony body with sagging, flabby skin mottled with age spots. A face with sharpened features and sunken eyes, sparse strands of gray on his skull. Most eerie was the broad, dreamy smile on the dead face. Before he died, Hoang had turned into an ancient old man, and yet while dying, he was perfectly happy. A few meters behind the table, the massive back wall of the temple was receding into darkness. The spotlights were positioned to illuminate the same spot in the wall, in which a small rectangular gap was visible. Sven walked over and peered into the hole. The passage went 10 meters deep into the wall, and then he could see a room. It was relatively small, microscopic by the standards of the temple, because it was pretty human in scale. In the light of the lighting tape hanging in the passage, and another spotlight in the room, Sven could clearly see the far wall. He also saw Otto and Alan Masterson lying on the room floor, or rather, what was left of them. If Hoang looked like a decrepit old man, there were two ancient, dried-up mummies lying on stone slabs in the thickness of the temple wall. Sven's first impulse was to go inside immediately, but he held back, remembering Otto's words. Under no circumstances enter the chamber. It sounded kind of delusional if it weren't for the two mummies on the floor and the 30-year-old Hoang, who had died of old age. Damn it, if only Otto had time to elaborate. Now, on the scene, thinking over the physicist's half-coherent story, Sven could reconstruct what had happened with a certain degree of probability, though he had no idea what caused all that. Otto and his assistants had found this passage in the wall and the inner chamber, and decided to investigate them without reporting anything beforehand. Unfortunately, it was in the physicist's nature to keep everybody unaware of his studies. They set up lights and equipment and went inside. Not awaiting any surprises or traps, you do not expect to find anything in good functioning condition in an almost billion-year-old structure. In the chamber, they had some kind of insight, after which Otto came out and contacted Sven, and while they were talking, a monstrously aged Hoang came out, fell, and died. Otto tried to resuscitate him and then went back into the chamber to get Alan out, and stayed in there himself. Sven understood that he couldn't go inside. Otto and Alan are beyond help, and it's too early for him to become a third mummy. But what had happened here? Sven couldn't imagine what could turn a young, healthy man into an old ruin, or even a mummy in a matter of moments. Some kind of radiation? But none of the types of radiation known to science had such an effect, although many could kill. At the same time, The lights in the passage and the chamber were still on, so the equipment was okay. Sven went to the desk to look for any notes, hypotheses, guesses, or anything to hold on to, and at that moment, he was struck. A strange, alien city spread out under an unaccustomed starry sky. At first, it seemed as if there was something wrong with his eyesight, but Sven quickly realized that it was an optical effect. The endless blocks of buildings stretched away, lost in the haze, to the very horizon, and the edges of the horizon seemed to curve upward, as if the city were located in a vast bowl. Sven couldn't feel his body, bow, or even put his hands to his face, but he was looking down as if he were standing on the roof of a building. There was something familiar about the buildings around him, despite how strange-looking they were. But Sven couldn't make out what it was until his point of view suddenly changed, as if he had taken off into the air and the city's streets began to recede. It finally dawned on him that he was seeing some kind of footage. The camera moved horizontally over the city. Sven noticed the city's streets were empty. No inhabitants, no cars, just solid rows and blocks of buildings, uniform in their inhuman architecture, yet somehow different. Then the camera lowered again, taking a close-up of one of the buildings, and Sven suddenly realized why everything seemed familiar to him. The whole city was made up of buildings like the temple. His imagination, which had not been very good at dealing with the scale of the temple before, refused to accept such a leap. There were thousands, hundreds of thousands of temples here. The camera soared into the sky, covering more and more area, accelerating until the stunned Sven saw that the bent edges of the horizon were not an illusion, that the city was not on a planet, but on a giant concave platform. Before he could realize what he was seeing, the image jumped, moving away from the platform at an incredible speed. Now he was looking at the arm of the galaxy with the red dot marking, obviously the platform coordinates. Then Sven saw something else, on the very edge of comprehension, but his consciousness was already fading. He was jolted awake by something painfully digging into his chest. He struggled to open his eyes and saw that he was lying slumped across the seat of the ATV, right on the field bag he had left behind. Apparently, he had crawled half-consciously to the vehicle before finally passing out, or waking up. Sven couldn't remember if there had been any gap between the last incoherent visions and the sharp pain in his chest, but he was grateful for the instinct that had pulled him away from the damned passage to the mysterious room. Really, it was time to get away. Surprised at how weak and disobedient his arms, legs, and whole body had become, he climbed onto the ATV, started the engine, and drove the vehicle toward the temple exit. His eyesight was a mess. Sven could only see the ATV's dashboard as if through a cloudy glass, but in the completely empty temple, he didn't have to worry about running into anything, and the giant doorway was an excellent landmark. He met the rescue party at the entrance, a 6-wheeled cargo rover with 8 people in it, including Noelani. She and 3 others immediately jumped onto the stone slabs and ran up to Sven. "I told you, I'd be fine," Sven said, watching the horrified faces of those around him. "I just need to get some rest." He wiped his face with his senile, weak hand and fell off the ATV. After 2 weeks spent in the temple and out at the vast expanse of Agasphere, the relatively spacious by shipboard standards infirmary ward was causing a slight background claustrophobia. On the other hand, Sven felt fed up with open space and large-scale structures. After everything on Agasphere, even a room the size of a closet would seem cozy and safe. The doctor said Sven had been unconscious for 3 days, and he'd been kept on life support devices and intravenous nutrition for almost all of that time. 100 years ago, you would probably barely had enough time to write the testament, Dr. Acevedo said, sitting in the chair beside Sven's bed. Now geriatrics has come a long way. God, I can't believe I'm telling you this. Acevedo shook his head sadly. We've done all we can, and I hope the Metu Clinic, they are leading the way in geriatric research, will do their best. I think they'll be able to level out the process to some extent and take a few years off. You have an extremely interesting case. I'm sorry. Acevedo interrupted himself. That was rude of me. Sven smiled. It's all right, Doc. You haven't offended me. The case is really unique. It is unlikely that they will find a man who has aged half a century in a few minutes. Why don't you tell me how things are now? Are the people evacuated from Agasphere? Acevedo stood up. Captain Pokrovsky asked me to notify him as soon as I could talk to you. I believe he's better qualified than I am to inform you of everything. He'll be here in a few minutes. In the meantime, with your permission? The doctor moved the regulator on the drip. This will give you some strength. Sven closed his eyes. Even a short conversation like this made him a little tired. He could only hope that the glucose mixed with stimulants, or whatever the doctor was pumping into his veins, would give him the strength to endure a much longer and more meaningful conversation with Pokrovsky. Growing old is not a pleasant process, but it is doubly unpleasant if it happens instantly and not in the course of decades, during which a person has time to get used to and come to terms with his new state. Ugh, or would it be the old state? Sven grinned involuntarily at the unexpected wordplay, and at that moment, the captain entered the room, followed by Noelani. Sven, I'm so sorry. Noelani was ahead of the captain, leaning over to Sven and hugging him tightly. Sven squeaked pitifully. Careful, Noe, please. I'm not much for violent displays of emotion now. Imagine you're hugging your great-great-grandfather. The girl blushed and pulled back. Sven noted that she looked different somehow. More mature? Yes. The experience would leave a mark on many people. Pokrovsky sat in the chair where Dr. Acevedo had just sat, crossed his legs, and interlocked his fingers on the knee. Noelani took a seat on the bed at Sven's feet. Well, it looks like you've acted as savior again, Pokrovsky said, smiling. If you hadn't managed to get out of the temple, we would definitely have tried to get you out of there. He grimaced. You and poor Otto, Alan, and Huang. I'm afraid they're destined to stay there forever, Sven said. I'm just lucky. If I had fainted on the way and fallen off the vehicle. But you didn't, Pokrovsky said firmly. Moreover, you managed to convince those who met you not to enter the temple. Sven looked at him, puzzled. I did? I don't remember that, sir. I thought I passed out right away. Almost, Pokrovsky said. I must say that your appearance was eloquent enough, but while already losing consciousness, you managed to say something like, in the temple of death. The vault of death, Noelani said. Sven took another look at her face. No. There was definitely something wrong with her, and her voice had changed. It was as if it were sharper, rougher. It suddenly struck him. Oh my God, Noe, you... Pokrovsky nodded. Before we could completely evacuate the camp, the outburst from the temple reached those who remained there, he said. Apparently, the power of the impact does not decrease linearly, but more quickly. Otherwise, the consequences could have been more tragic, but all those who remained on the surface of Agasphere lost a few years. So small compared to you, Noelani said, smiling wryly. That makes sense, Sven said thoughtfully. Part of his mind was occupied with guilt and bitterness. Noelani, a few years of youth, and the other part was already hypothesizing and theorizing. The information wave hit me some distance from the main chamber, though not far away. Apparently, the decreasing function is quite sharp, and I didn't get hit as hard as Otto and the others. Pokrovsky looked at Sven inquisitively. An information wave? Sven shrugged his shoulders. I don't know how to define it correctly. You need a physicist here, not an exo-psychologist. He paused. Yeah. Noe, tell me, did you feel anything when the wave reached the camp? Noelani shook her head. Nothing in particular. There was some sense of touching distant depths, of something great, but all very vague, and behind the general commotion, no one paid much attention to it. We didn't even notice our changes right away. That's right, Sven nodded. It was almost a fading echo. He looked at Pokrovsky. Sir, the thing is that the temple is not a temple at all. It's actually a memory cell, and what killed the physicists, crippled me, and stole several years of life from the rest of us is not some horrible death wave, but an information packet. Don't ask me what form that information was transmitted in, he said, seeing the captain's and Noelani's blank stares. But it was information. It wasn't even what was written in the cell, but only, so to speak, the familiarization part. Something like the boot information that is displayed on the screen when a computer boots up. He was quiet for a moment. Before returning for Alan, Otto told me they had found the clue to our entire universe. I think the cell managed to transmit to them some of what was recorded in it. The hypothesis that information can directly affect living organisms has been around for a long time, Noelani said. Although, of course, almost all scientists considered it marginal. I think the temple, I'll call it that for now so as not to confuse myself, somehow uses time itself to record information, Sven said. This also explains the incredible preservation of the building throughout almost 1 billion years. And I can see why there are no inscriptions or anything like that. We don't write anything on every microcrystal inside the processors either. This wave has no effect on tech devices except for impenetrability for all types of communication, Pokrovsky said. But the animals we used for some testing, unfortunately, died. We left a few automated cages with them in the camp. We thought we would take them back later with a remote landing module. The longer the exposure to the information release, the stronger the effect, Sven said. The temple gave out information in pulses with increasing duration and power. The 3 physicists were together in the startup chamber when they received the first packet. Immediately afterward, Otto came out from the chamber to contact me, at which point Huang and Alan received another pulse. Huang left the chamber and died, and Otto returned for Alan and got hit by another pulse. He stopped talking to catch his breath. Dr. Acevedo's stimulants were working, but they could only mobilize the body's existing strength, and Sven was now running low on that resource. I think the cell was triggered by the presence of intelligent beings. Or just living beings, Noelani said. There's a reason why Agasphere is practically sterile. It's like a microelectronics factory or a computer center. No one wants a cockroach stuck somewhere between the contacts. The question could be put a little differently, Pokrovsky said dryly. Was Agasphere sterilized for the smooth functioning of the temple? Or because of him? Sven suddenly felt an irresistible urge to close his eyes and take a nap. He pulled his already floating consciousness to the surface, especially since what he was about to say could cause insomnia in anyone, even someone as inflexible as Captain Pokrovsky. I hate to break it to you, sir, but the real question is something else, he said. What happens if the entire computing device, whose memory cell is the temple, turns on and starts working? What measures are provided by its creators to maintain purity inside the circuit? There was a tense silence. Finally, Pokrovsky asked, "What do you mean?" "In the part of the package that I managed to get..." Sven kept his eyes closed. He felt so weak. It contained all the same things as the normal boot information. For example, information about the system, its dimensions. And what were its dimensions? Do you remember? Sven paused for a moment, gathering his strength. I'm afraid to disappoint you, sir, but as large as possible. He remembered the picture dotted with red sparks. That computer system is the entire universe. I keep thinking, what if we just turned it on? Isolation period. To Matuan? Avi stood up in surprise, having lost some sense of subordination. The rainbow orblings from Regul 5, which had been cruising leisurely beneath the office ceiling, fled in different directions like a flock of huge soap bubbles scattered by a small tornado. The office of Anton Hansen, the almighty owner of the Intergalactic Services Corporation, was located virtually outside the Iona orbital station. Only a sigma field membrane separated the exquisitely luxurious environment from the icy vacuum. Maintaining a sigma field envelope of such a diameter required incredible energy. Avi estimated it would take the output from at least a couple of medium-power quark reactors. When you're given a task by the owner of such an office, you must listen, even if the task seems like a crazy whim. Excuse me, sir, but what's the point? Avi asked. He thought his relationship with Hansen was good enough, even close as it could be, given the gap in their financial and social status, but still not close enough to allow him to say, "What kind of idiotic idea is that? Matuan is such a backwater. Why do we need it? It's too far away. If it wasn't, tourists would have been pouring in long ago." Hansen, dressed in the latest fashion of billionaires, in a living veil from Ptolemy II, waved his hand with a glass clasped in it. From this movement, a few drops of golden firelight liquor, with extract from crystal mushrooms of Electra and pheromone additives made from the flowers of treehouses from the planet Adson, spilled out of the glass. Those few drops cost more than Avi earned in a year. Avi looked at the slightly trembling living veil that covered Hansen's body, and partially Hansen's arms and legs, and shuddered. Some fashion trends were too much, even for him. We should always try to look at the perspective of a subject from a new point of view, Hansen said. I thought you should know that, with your experience. Avi hated it when his boss alluded to his past. He'd come to the IST with a degree in xenobiology, a stint in the Federation Diplomatic Corps on Grace of God, and a few years on a smuggler's shuttle in the Z sector. It all didn't seem like time was well spent for him, but his boss insisted that it was in the varied experience that the success of one of the best ISC operatives lay. Did you hear that the great queen of the Sulpadians had authorized the allocation of 2 minor swarms? Of course. Avi tried to figure out what this had to do with his sudden deployment to Matuan. Sulpadians swarmed pretty often, and every now and then, the great queen, instead of destroying her rivals, would authorize the separation of minor swarms. In exchange for their complete loyalty to the Great Hive, of course. But what does this have to do with intergalactic? We don't seem to be in the business of large-scale colony ships. Why, maybe we should. Hansen took another careless sip worth several $100,000 and set the glass on the table. But the point is different. Anyway, one of the minor swarms bought a planet in the Dago system from the Federation that was worthless in most aspects, but suitable enough to start a new hive, and the official who made the deal somehow overlooked the fact that the planet was inhabited. Avi stared at the chief in surprise. The Federation had sold the planet to the Sulpadians along with the population? He shook his head incredulously. No. I've known about government corruption, but something like that, I don't believe it. Population is a strong word, Hansen replied. Perhaps this foreign ministry official was really out of touch. Maybe he used outdated data. These people arrived there only about 10 years ago and didn't register as a new colony. In fact, that was their plan. They don't recognize any governments and specifically choose a place where they wouldn't be disturbed. The Brotherhood of Cosmic Light. Have you ever heard of them? Avi shrugged. The galaxy was full of the most amazing religions and sects, and it was hard to keep track of them all. Not that it was that exciting either. Well, never mind, Hansen said, obviously pleased that he had discovered something he knew more about than his assistant. They are very few, only a few dozen people. When the foreign ministry discovered that they had sold a populated planet to the Sulpadians, of course, they got nervous, and they decided to find a hole where they could shove the cultists in without much fuss. They only dream of such a hole anyway. Avi began to realize what was going on, and it was finally decided to move these cultists to Matuan, he asked. And who came up with the idea? I did. Hansen grinned. They were in a bit of a state of confusion, I'd say even panic, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to milk the Federation. So I made a quick retroactive license for the exclusive use of Matuan and casually asked the right people if they could use a cozy little planet on the backside of the galaxy. Avi remained silent. The chief's ability to extract huge profits as if by magic had long ago ceased to surprise him. All in all, it worked out just fine, and everyone was happy, Hansen summarized, but there didn't seem to be much pleasure in his voice. Something must have gone wrong in the end, or else why Chief is sending him to Matuan. Where does my business trip fit into this scheme? Avi asked, seeing that the chief was waiting for him to take the initiative. Hansen waved away an orbling that flew too close to his head. This is the worst part, he said without enthusiasm. The cultists had no trouble getting to Matuan and settling there, but when the Migration Board Commission investigators flew there 6 months later, they found no one. What do you mean? Avi asked. They'd gone somewhere else? That's what I have to find out. Hansen shook his head. But given that they didn't have their own ship and the officials found the abandoned camp, it seems that something happened on the planet itself, and now the foreign ministry is charging me with the claim that I withheld data about Matuan's danger to the colonists. Hansen looked directly into Avi's eyes. So get over there and discover what happened before this scandal goes supernova. You realize the government would love to blow this case out of proportion to cover up their blunder in selling off a populated planet. I'm counting on you. When Avi was already in the doorway, Hansen called out to him. Oh, and one more thing. The case is exceptional, so I've found you a partner to match it. Avi looked questioningly at the chief. Don't worry. I know you're used to working alone, Hansen said. But this guy won't get in your way. On the contrary, I think you've heard of him. He's an exo-psychologist, and his name is Sven Tomberg. Thank God the famous exo-psychologist was not as pompous as Avi had feared, but he looked much older than his 35 years, so much so that Avi first wondered if Hansen had gotten it wrong. Sven obviously noticed the new partner's confusion because he smiled friendly and extended his fragile, pigmented hand first. Sven Tomberg, he introduced himself formally. But of course, you already know. Avi Numal. Avi shook the scientist's hand, which was unexpectedly strong. Of course, I was warned of your arrival. It's just that you look more... He was suddenly embarrassed, something that hadn't happened to him in a long time. Don't worry, Avi. I'm used to it, Sven said. In fact, I'm now looking better. After the incident on Agasphere, I was in much worse shape. Of course, Avi silently cursed. How could he forget? The information temporal shock on Agasphere, which had stolen a good chunk of Tomberg's and some of the expedition's other members' lives. I'm sorry, Avi said. I told you not to. Sven looked around the interior of the main cabin with curiosity. It's not a bad ship. For its size, it's excellent. I bet the personal cabins are decent too. Hansen must be a pretty generous employer. Avi was glad the scientist had changed the subject. That depends, I guess, he said. Personally, I'm not complaining. Is this your first time working for Intergalactic? Yes, Sven sighed. After my forced retirement from the Science Corps, it took me some time to, restore my health. But after that, I was still faced with the question, what to do now? The doctors say that despite all the circumstances, I have at least 30 years of active life ahead of me. Although the Corps pension allows me to indulge in idleness, I'm not psychologically ready for it. I may look like Methuselah's older brother, but I don't feel like that. So when I got the offer from your chief, I didn't hesitate long, but I'm afraid you'll have to do most of the legwork. I'm not very good at it anymore. I'm used to it, Avi said. I've been on planets way more unpleasant than Matuan. By the way, what about the planet? Sven asked. I haven't had time to familiarize myself with the materials. It was only 24 hours from my agreement to my arrival on your ship. As far as I know, it's somewhere on the edge of the desolation. That's right. That's right. Avi picked up the exo-psychologist's bag, noting that the scientist was clearly accustomed to the bare minimum of necessities. The bag was light and not too bulky. But I suggest that we don't waste time on talking now. We have a long way to go. We will have time to study and discuss everything on the way. The war between the Qatar and the Mercurians ended in mutual annihilation 1,000,000 years ago. But the galaxy has never fully healed the scar that conflict left on it. Thousands upon thousands of devastated star systems with planets turned into dead balls of stone or no planets at all, but with several asteroid belts. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the Qatar and Mercurian technology was still inferior to the fantastic structures of the Precursors in terms of durability, and most of it could not survive such a long time. Humans and the other races that inhabited the galaxy were left with only majestic ruins on lifeless planets and very rare finds that had long since lost even a hint of functionality. This area, far enough away from the densely populated sectors of the galaxy, was unofficially named Desolation. The planet Matuan was discovered by accident. A Canadian Commonwealth research ship had gotten off course over 2 centuries ago. It was, for some time, stuck in the Matuan system. The Canadians gave the same name both to the star and the only habitable planet, more concerned with how they could repair the jump engines. The Canadians hastily surveyed the planet and departed as soon as they were able to get the engines working. The reason was simple. The planet was too far to colonize. Besides, the planet lay literally on the edge of the desolation, which was almost superstitiously feared by many intelligent races, including the Canadians. Who would want to live near a giant 1,000,000-year-old graveyard? Occasionally, other scouts visited the planet and left with approximately the same impression. Despite a good climate and not too aggressive biosphere, the planet had no special advantages that could make Matuan attractive from the point of view of potential colonization. There were plenty of worlds suitable for settlement in the galaxy. Then, one of the most meticulous researchers discovered the Rainbow Valley, an unusual formation in the mountainous region, a giant crystalline formation in volcanic rock, several tens of square kilometers in size. It would seem to be an excellent object to attract tourists. But everything was again broken by the remoteness of the planet. Of course, the jump engines had become much more efficient since Matuan's discovery, and it took 3 weeks to get to the planet, instead of 6 months. But it was still too long. Nothing was interesting on the planet besides Rainbow Valley. No one would spend a month plus for a landmark that could be fully discovered at a leisurely pace in half a day. Matuan had remained a half-forgotten world until Hansen pulled his scam with the Federation and the Sulpadians. Sven and Avi learned all this and some other specific details: mass, percentage of land and sea, atmospheric composition, summary of major animal and plant species, from the few previous research reports during their journey to Matuan. They also remarkably improved their skills at Go, chess, and Sulpadia Norpong, and their physical performance at the gym was to the best of their abilities. In short, they were desperately bored the whole way, and Avi was beginning to think it might be a good idea to find some new species on the planet, like tyrannosaurs or dust devils from Castrum 3, to hunt. "You think the situation on the planet when we get there will not be enough to energize you?" Sven asked. As Avi overcame the embarrassment that his new partner looked twice his age, they quickly switched to a friendly tone. "Frankly, I doubt it," Avi said. "I'm beginning to think these cultists just ate some local fungi and died in the jungle or something. I mean, as much as I want to have fun, there's nothing more dangerous on this planet than poisonous mushrooms, and certainly no species that can eat a bunch of fanatics. What if it was some kind of bacteria or virus? Then there'd be graves and dead bodies," Avi countered. "No, I'm telling you, they did something wrong. Maybe they killed themselves by drowning in the ocean. I've heard that happens to cultists sometimes." "Maybe, but I don't think so." Sven thought for a moment. "I'm interested in this Rainbow Valley. There's not much information about it in the reports except that it has a lot of crystals." "What kind?" "Why not a word about it?" "And that it's beautiful. By the way, it's not far from where those, what's their name, Brothers of Cosmic Light have settled." Avi checked the report and hummed in surprise. "Maybe you got something here." "You think so?" Avi looked at Sven with respect. The guy was a quick thinker after all. They had settled 15 kilometers from the anomaly, almost next door to it. "Do you think this has something to do with the disappearance?" Sven shrugged. "That's what we'll find out first, as soon as we get there." Avi stood up and stretched with pleasure, crunching almost every joint. "I don't usually anticipate going in guns blazing, especially in such dark cases of missing people. But I'm ready for anything now, just to stretch my legs a little." Sven looked at him carefully. "Why? Have you often had to investigate disappearances?" Avi answered with the same direct look. "You don't even want to know," he replied. The local sun was almost at its highest, and it was a little hotter than Avi would have liked in the open countryside, but he enjoyed it all the same. Everything felt nice: the vastness, the slightly stuffy light wind, the blue sky, the greenery around him, and the unfamiliar foreign smell. He was lucky with the last one, by the way. Not always a complex of flavors of another planet leaves at least a tolerable impression. Matuan smelled of a tart mixture, remotely reminiscent of the mixed scent of a flower garden and some chemicals. The odor was a bit pungent, but Avi quickly got used to it. Avi landed the shuttle a couple kilometers from the abandoned cultist village on the edge of a large forested area. The outermost buildings were in plain sight, standard fast-built plastic cottages, a perfect landmark amidst Matuan's unspoiled nature. Avi headed toward them across a field of thick but relatively low grass. The grass was tangled and pretty stiff, and his feet stuck in it. After a few minutes, Avi was sweating, but it was still better than the dull panels of the ship's interior cladding. From time to time, Avi glanced up at the blue peaks of the mountain range on the horizon. Somewhere out there was the Rainbow Valley. "Nice planet," came the voice of Sven in his earpiece, who had stayed in the ship in geostationary orbit and was watching through a pair of cameras built into Avi's gear. "Those are usually the ones where you get the worst surprises," Avi said. "I disagree," Sven said. "It's just that people tend to be more relaxed on planets like this. If you were surrounded by poisonous fumaroles and lava lakes, you'd be as focused as you could be. But in blooming fields under the warm sun, few people can stay frosty. Avi thought about it and immediately stumbled over a particularly wicked tangle of grass. "Yeah, I guess there's something to it," he said, shaking the fluff of flying seeds off the pants of his protective coveralls. "Maybe the cultists fell for it too." The grass ended, giving way to densely compacted soil between the houses. Not a blade of grass was visible in the passages of the settlement. It had obviously been specially treated with some kind of defoliants. It seemed unnecessarily barbaric to Avi, but on the other hand, he understood the settlement's inhabitants. Walking through the local grass was a curse, probably as bad as mowing it regularly. "I'm in the village," he said. "Not a soul in sight yet, and it looks abandoned. It looks like we'll have to agree with the commission's conclusions here. Commission or not, but we'll have to see for ourselves. So go as planned." Over the next hour, Avi went house by house through the village. There were only 46 people, including a few families, so the houses were few. 24, including outbuildings. He found no signs of fighting, no signs that the settlement had been abandoned in a hurry, but there was also no sign of anyone packing up for the road. It was as if all the inhabitants had suddenly, quietly, unhurriedly, gotten up in what they were wearing and left in an unknown direction. That was strange. Avi slowly rotated 360 degrees, standing in the middle of the small central square so that Sven could feel the spooky atmosphere of the abandoned village. Between the houses at the southern end, the remnants of a vegetable garden and an established fruit orchard, already overgrown with local weeds, were visible. Some local creeping plants were already climbing up the thin trunks of the saplings. I've seen a lot of things, but this one was very uncomfortable. Frankly, I'd feel a lot better if this place was covered in shell casings and blood. At least it would be clear what's up. As of now, I'm just thinking of all sorts of crazy things. "Like what?" Sven asked immediately. "I am asking not out of idle curiosity. You're an experienced man, and your hunches and impressions are worth a lot. For example, that they've all fallen into another dimension," Avi said with a chuckle. "Or were kidnapped by a super race for experimentation. I think I've read too much cheap sci-fi on this flight." "Experiments, you say?" Sven said thoughtfully. "Experiments are my specialty. We'll figure it out. Listen, there is one other building on the commission blueprint named Temple of Light. It's about 1 kilometer to the west. We should check that too. Can't see anything from here, but there's a big hill, probably blocking the view. Moving out." The building, proudly labeled Temple on the plan, was the same standard barracks, only larger. Like most of the other buildings, its doors were ajar. Avi cautiously walked around the house and peered through one of the windows, almost expecting to see something horrible that would reveal the mystery of the people's disappearance. Nothing. Empty, dusty benches and passageways through which a draft lazily rolled dry debris that had been accidentally brought inside during months of desertion. "Wait," Sven said as Avi was about to leave. "What's that at the far end of the hall?" Avi looked closer, and a brilliant, iridescent sparkle struck him from the dusty semi-darkness. "So Rainbow Valley it is," Avi said, looking at the sparkling crystal on a special pedestal. Sven had called it an altar, but Avi still couldn't believe that someone could be stupid enough to worship a piece of mineral. "I'm not sure of anything yet," Sven said, "but you'd better not touch it just in case. You'll have to walk to Rainbow Valley, though, if only to rule out any unnecessary coincidences." Avi looked at the crystal carefully. It was amazing how beautiful it was. It was as if the sunlight had gotten inside, lost in a billion inner facets, and split into all parts of the spectrum. which began to play catch-up. The colored sparks shimmered into each other. "Avi!" Sven's shout brought Avi out of his stupor. He woke up and turned away from the tantalizing light play of the crystal with difficulty. "Yes, I heard you," he said dryly, "but I'm not going on foot. 15 kilometers in the heat and off-road. It's crazy. See if there's a place for the shuttle to land." He thought his first impression of the crystal had prepared him for the panorama of Rainbow Valley, but he had no idea how wrong he was. As he stepped out from behind the rocky ledge on the pass, he stood still for a few minutes, stunned by the sight before him. The fractal ocean of iridescent flame was so striking that at first glance, he couldn't even make out the details of the landscape, as if Avi were looking at a stereo screen with a psychedelic screensaver instead of a mountain valley. "Wow," Sven said. Obviously, the incredible sight amazed him too, even considering the not-so-great quality of the picture from the small cameras. The travel agencies have made a big mistake. I think people would have willingly traveled 6 months for something like this. Avi shook his head, chasing away the obsession. "You know, all the old valley pictures look much more modest," he said. "And it's not just the equipment's imperfections. Some are made with much cooler equipment than I'm wearing." "I agree," said Sven. "Yes, it's beautiful. Yes, iridescent shimmers. Yes, huge crystal clusters glittering in the sun, but it's not even close to this. Looks like something has been happening in the valley since the last time it was visited. Somehow it's evolving, if that's what it is, of course. But actually, there's something else I want to tell you, which worries me more than the light music." "What is it?" Avi asked, instantly alarmed. You'd think a show like this would be obvious from orbit, even in the daytime, especially with the unremarkable dark mountains all around. But I can't see much of anything. There are just occasional light reflections, no more than from a small mountain lake. Avi raised his head to the sky. "Maybe some kind of aerial lens? I don't seem to notice anything, but hell knows my eyes are a little blurry from all this disco." "I don't see anything either," Sven said, "and all the equipment is silent. I'll try to play with the settings, but I'm no atmospheric expert." Avi turned his gaze back to the valley. His eyes seemed to get used to it, and he began to recognize the regular rocky surface between the giant conglomerates of crystals shimmering with reflected light. "I'll try to go down," Avi said. "It's passable. Listen, something else occurred to me. Why did none of the research missions take samples of crystals from the valley? We don't even know what they are." "That's a good point," Sven said. "There's something fishy going on, so be careful out there. If you smell anything, you come right back." "Don't jinx it," said Avi. "I still hope it's all just nature's light music. Damn, I must be getting old. I forgot I can polarize my visor." After turning on the helmet's visor's polarization, Avi was immediately relieved. The iridescent reflections in the crystals were still weaving their hypnotic fractal patterns, but they were no longer blinding. Avi made his way down to the bottom of the valley, where there was surprisingly more room. "Sven, I think I see something ahead," he said, looking around. "It looks like an artificial structure, though I can't see it because of the crystals. I'm heading that way." "Be careful," Sven reminded him again, but Avi was already in full battle mode. He took the safety off his assault rifle just in case, even though he had no idea what he was going to shoot at. A few minutes later, Avi reached the location. "I'll be jeesh," he muttered, stunned. "Sven, are you seeing this too?" The answer from his partner came only after a few seconds. "If you mean an ancient spaceship of completely unknown construction, then yes," Sven finally said. "I see it too. It's not a hallucination or a mirage." The ship wasn't very big, probably even smaller than the one Tomberg was in on the orbit. It was hard to tell for sure, since it was partially obscured by piles of crystals, and it looked ancient and alien. None of the known space races of the galaxy had ever built a ship like this. There was no symmetry, a weird chaos of sharp angles and edges, and yet it was clear that it was a ship. "It looks like it was here before Rainbow Valley was formed," Avi said. "Judging by the mass of crystals right on the hull. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but don't you think that's what we're seeking? Of course, after is not always the same as because, but I do," said Sven. "Look closely at the geometry of the ship itself. Doesn't it remind you of anything?" Avi took a closer look and suddenly realized. The dark metal of the hull seemed alien against the glow of the valley, even if it was muted by the visor. But after Sven's remark, it was clear that the unusual combination of the ship's facets repeated the most common shapes of the crystals that filled the valley. Avi noted this strange metal's almost complete lack of corrosion and wear. "Do you think this thing created the valley?" "It could very well be," Sven said. "It could very well be," Sven said. "Listen, is everything okay with your cameras down there? I'm losing the picture." "I think so. The batteries and indicators are all green. Maybe it's this lens or whatever, blocking the view or some kind of interference from the crystals. There didn't seem to be anything about that in the reports." "I can hear you fine, but anyway, let's have a quick look around and get out of there, and then we'll decide what to do next. The ship is a unique find, but it's not worth the risk, especially since we're not here for it," Avi added as he approached the massive hull. "Interesting. It's like there's a hatch open, and all this crystalline jungle seems to have sprouted from there. At least that's what it looks like. Oh, shit. Avi, what's going on down there?" Sven called out anxiously. Avi squeezed the rifle's grip, though it was useless now. "I found our missing colonists," he said. "And it's very, very bad news. Looks like the damn commission was right." Damn. That's a scary sight. I think Hansen will have a hard time proving in court that his conclusion that Matuan was safe for the colonists was valid. Avi waved his hand. He'd get away with it, not the first time. And even if he didn't, he'd find a way to profit from it. It was a unique discovery. "I thought he'd sold the rights to the planet." Avi grinned broadly. "I know my boss. I'm sure he left a loophole in the contract, and more than one." They were sitting in the ship's control room in front of a large screen, where a freeze frame of the footage Avi had taken of the alien ship cast iridescent glows. There were huge clusters of crystals all around, but the side of the ship was free of them, with a few exceptions. 46 exceptions to be exact. The colonists' bodies were fused into the crystals as if they had grown around them, though it wasn't entirely clear how they could grow at such a rate. By the way, how do they grow here at all? Avi thought. This isn't exactly a vat of saturated solution. But the unfortunate people were not completely sealed in the crystals, like flies in amber. Parts of their bodies had been crystallized too. One man was immersed in the crystal only with his left half, while the right half turned into a cluster of tiny crystals remotely resembling a human silhouette. The iridescent glow made it impossible to see the boundary between living flesh and crystalline mass. But Avi decided it was for the best. He got into the shuttle and returned to Sven almost immediately after he discovered the alien ship and the colonists' remains, only taking a few minutes to take pictures. Sven didn't even have to convince him. The sight of the dead colonists was too gruesome. "All right, I have some grave questions that I can't answer yet," Sven said, curling his fingers. "First, how come none of the reports mention the alien ship? It's obviously been lying there since time immemorial. Secondly, Why had the colonists chosen a place near Rainbow Valley for their settlement? That's easy to answer, Avi said. Remember what they call themselves? The Brotherhood of Cosmic Light, and this is the literal embodiment of those words. Suppose so, Sven nodded. But that's not all. Why are there no samples of the crystals, or even the results of their research? The cultists, by the way, took one and brought it to their temple. Fourth, what is this phenomenon of optical impassibility over the valley? We still can't see the valley from orbit. Fifth, what the hell happened to the cultists? Avi picked up on that. And sixth, whose ship is this? And what are these crystals? The last question is the most important, Sven said thoughtfully. If we answer it, we will probably find the answers to the rest. If we consider where we are, I can bring up one hypothesis. He squinted and looked at Avi. But I'm afraid you wouldn't. He was interrupted by the buzzer of an urgent hyperlink. Given that they were a long way from habitable sectors of the galaxy, and the energy costs of hyperpackets rose exponentially with distance, such a packet meant two things. First, it was Hansen, and second, something out of the ordinary had happened. Avi walked over to the communications console, pressed the receive button, and ran his eyes over the message that appeared on the screen. It was short, only a few lines, but it must have cost the sender 6 figures. I don't understand it, he said, confused. Hansen reports that there's a mutiny in the axial sector. Some lunatics revolted and took over several planets and large stations, including Mars. Earth and the Sirius planets are under blockade. Hansen's headquarters had also been attacked, but his special forces had repelled the attack. He stared at the screen, not believing his eyes. The rebellion is being led by members of the commission who worked here on Matuan. Hansen wants us to come back with the results of the investigation, but we haven't gotten anywhere yet. He turned to Sven and was momentarily speechless with amazement. The scientist looked at him through the protective plastic of a full-face gas mask. In his hands, he held a small cylinder. "Sven, what the hell?" yelled Avi, and rushed toward Tomberg, but didn't make it. At the very last moment, before he passed out, he noticed that the valve on the cylinder was open, and a faint cloud was escaping from the nozzle. There were no dreams, but Avi woke up with the feeling of having been plagued by intrusive nightmares for a long time. Nor was there the usual feeling that his body had rested and recovered, though he was sure he'd slept for 8 to 10 hours at least. Besides, at the very edge of his conscious memory, there was something else troubling and unsettling lurking. He remembered. "Sven!" Avi jumped up from his bunk and rushed to the cabin door, but it wouldn't open. "Sorry, Avi, I had to lock it." Sven's voice came from behind him. Avi turned around swiftly. Sven was looking at him from a small screen on the wall. His mask was gone, of course, and his aged face, Sven was only 35, Avi reminded himself, was clearly concerned. "What the hell is going on?" Avi demanded. "Are you out of your mind?" Sven shook his head. "Not me." Avi became angry. "What are you implying? You're the one who knocked me out and locked me up. If either of us has gone mad—" "I hope not," Sven said. "But I should have taken precautions." "You should have," said Avi, feeling his insides boiling. "Because if I manage to get out of here, you'll be in trouble. You're not leaving your quarters until we get back, and I talked to Hansen," Sven said calmly. "I don't know what he'll do, but we have to ensure you're not under the influence of the Mercurians. Hansen will send you to a place you haven't even heard of yet." "Wait, what did you say? What Mercurians? The ones who fought the Qatar? What the hell are you talking about? That was 1,000,000 years ago." "The same ones." Sven nodded. "Need I remind you that Matuan is literally on the doorstep of the desolation? That's probably why their ship escaped the Qatar, but not completely. It crashed on Matuan and stayed there the whole time. Avi was so interested that he forgot about his anger and resentment. Wait, that's nonsense. No biological species would have lasted this long. He stopped suddenly. Exactly. Sven winked at him as if rewarding him for his cleverness. From what we know about the Mercurians, it's a foregone conclusion that they were of non-biological nature, if only because the Qatar have managed to enslave every biological species they've encountered in the course of their galactic expansion. It was still unknown whether the Mercurians were rebellious machines of the Qatar themselves or had evolved in some other way. Perhaps the Rainbow Valley will give us the answer. Are you saying that the crystals? I don't know. Sven shrugged. Maybe it's some kind of degraded Mercurian AI system, or maybe the Mercurians themselves, who have degenerated over 1,000,000 years. In any case, through this incredible period, they have carried one thing: hatred for biological civilizations and the desire to destroy them at any cost. I think it's the Mercurians themselves who fell into a pre-intelligent state and began to regain glimmers of their former intelligence only when their former enemies came to visit them again. Wait, what enemies are we? Our ancestors ate bananas and chased gophers in Africa with a club when this war raged. During the war, any intelligent species was an absolute slavery to the Qatar and therefore an enemy of the Mercurians. I'm not sure these crystals in Rainbow Valley realize the war is long over, but when the cultists showed up, they didn't hesitate to take the opportunity to study them. Why not if the prey offers itself as a sacrifice? The cultists thought they'd found God. I guess one of the main methods of warfare for the Mercurians was reprogramming Qatar slaves and sending them back as saboteurs. That's probably also why there's been a surge of activity in the valley. And when the commission showed up, the Mercurians were ready for the operation? Avi asked. What about the communication failures, the invisibility, the incomplete reports? Rudimentary cloaking skills, Sven replied. It doesn't take much intelligence. Chameleons and octopuses can handle it. By the way, the rebellion is almost over. We're not Qatar slaves after all. We have more free will. Right now, the scientists are dealing with the surviving members of the commission. Hopefully, by the time we return, they'll know what to do in your case. My case? Avi asked, looking directly at the screen. Sven sighed. Well, you've been to the valley and exposed to the Mercurians. I'm assuming the programming is done with this fractal light mosaic of theirs. On the surface, you seem fine. But so did the commission members, until they got the chance. I can't take any chances. That's understandable, Avi said, and I'm not even arguing. But I wasn't the only one watching the Mercurian disco. Someone else was looking at it too. I agree, through the screen, but not all the members of the commission landed on the planet, and everyone rebelled. Sven smiled. What makes you think I made an exception? He turned the camera around, showing his quarters to the Avi. I locked myself in the cabin and melted the locks with a small clockwork mine. The ship is flying on autopilot, and when it arrives at Iona, it will slow down and begin transmitting the message I programmed for Hansen and the Intergalactic Special Forces. Synthesizer food isn't like my kitchen delights, but we'll get by for a couple months. It's not that long of an isolation period. He was quiet for a moment. Certainly less than 1,000,000 years on a desert planet. Quarantine planet. Sunsets really are amazing here, Avi said, admiring the red sky, which was also reflected in the surprisingly calm sea, adding some golden glow to the beauty. It's a shame we won't be here long. Usually I don't like to linger on uninhabited worlds, but I'd like to stay here for a month to rest and relax. Wasn't your last adventure enough? Sven asked. Didn't you get enough rest? Avi shuddered and finished his glass in a gulp to lighten the mood. You know, 3 weeks of solitary confinement doesn't really fit my idea of a pleasant vacation, he said, especially with the prospect of being a lab rat as a bonus at the end of the trip. Sven shrugged and made himself comfortable on the bed. Well, Hansen made up for all our worries and inconveniences, didn't he? In fact, even this business trip of ours could be considered part of the compensation. That's true. Avi poured himself another tonic. Unfortunately, there's not much for us to do here. The planet is marvelous and seems completely safe. No serious predators, no particularly malignant microorganisms that a standard bioblockade can't cope with, not even natural disasters. It's a rare paradise world, which means there's nothing for guys like you and me to do here. But I'd still come here someday for a good vacation. Sven looked at him with a grin. Avi, have you seen the resort area designs provided by Hansen's office? Once construction is complete, the most you'll be able to afford is stereo images from orbit. Hansen is building this resort for himself and his friends, not for his subordinates, even useful ones like you and me. Well, such are the realities of our world, Avi sighed. Paradise exists, but the entrance tickets are affordable only for a select few. Still, it's nice to know it's there, and you've even had your week in it. He'd never been so wrong. Avi had long ago realized that the goddess of fate had a rather perverse sense of humor, but now she was obviously in a particularly dark mood as she refuted his rant about paradise in the most radical and unapologetic way. What could be more radical than a man with an arrow in his eye falling from the pavilion's roof onto the drinks table? The security perimeter is in place, Sven said. All teams have returned to the base. There are no more casualties except for poor Shubin. How is he, by the way? Avi looked at the unusually quiet surroundings of the base camp. No threat to his life, but Hansen will have to pay for the services of cybernetic saints from the grace of God. Evgeny lost an eye. Good thing the arrow was from far away, and the bow it came from was weak. If it had entered deeper, just a couple of centimeters, he waved his hand. He's lying in the infirmary cursing Hansen and the paradise planets. We'll have to visit him, Sven said. But that's later, and as for now, what do we know? Avi pensively patted his palm on the transparent plastic of the service dome they were in. Even though the entire base camp was now covered by a protective force field, the current order advised the staff not to unnecessarily go out into the open. Not much, he said. Shubin was working on the pavilion's roof, setting up filming equipment for the biologists. He claims he only noticed some movement at the far end of the roof, and then a sharp pain and a fall. Well, what's on the far end? Nothing much. Avi shrugged. You can see some vague footprints and some clay on the roof. There are stacks of materials and crates at the back, so anyone could have gotten on the roof. The clay dried out, but we collected samples. The chemists in the lab are working on them now. Maybe they find anything. So we have no idea who shot Shubin. Sven squinted at his friend. Look, we've been here for 3 weeks, and we haven't seen even a hint of intelligent species on the planet, even at a primitive stage of development, especially near the camp. You don't think that it was? That it was one of our people who tried to settle the score with Shubin? Avi finished the question. No. First of all, it's nonsense. Evgeny is the nicest man, and I can't imagine one of our surveyors or botanists trying to put an arrow in the head of one of his colleagues with a homemade bow. I won't even talk about motive. But most importantly, look at this. He handed Sven an arrow in a sealed plastic bag. Well, you can't argue with that, Sven said, examining the evidence. Thank God Shubin's blood had been washed off the arrow, and it looked more like a museum piece than a dangerous projectile. A typical arrow straight out of the Neolithic, small one, and primitive enough. The plumage is not taped too neatly, the shaft is not polished, and the bone tip is fixed with some solidified plant resin. You know, that's the most important evidence that a native shot it. Sven grinned wryly. Because of all our people, there's only one person who could authentically make a thing like that. Me. But I have, as you realize, an absolute alibi. One thing remains to be understood, Avi said. How did we manage to miss intelligent natives here, much less Neolithic hunters? It's unlikely they came from a neighboring continent to see who was visiting them from the stars. You'd be surprised how far Neolithic hunters can travel in a day, Sven said. But I agree. We have carefully studied a huge area, especially places where there are usually traces of primitive tribes, the shores of rivers and lakes, for example. There wasn't the slightest hint of anything like that. No campfires, trash heaps, or remnants of any kind of huts. Where had they come from? He put the arrow on the table. We need to find out as soon as possible. The presence of intelligent life on the planet changes all our plans, and Hansen's plans for a resort planet for the chosen few. I'll launch a few scout drones, Avi said. If they exist, I think we'll find them in a couple or 3 days. However, some things became obvious much sooner. The next morning, Sven had barely had time to eat breakfast and get to work parsing the detailed satellite data, hoping to find the mysterious natives, when an agitated Avi burst into the dome. They caught the drone? Sven looked at Avi incredulously. Are you serious? You bet they did, Avi nodded, and almost shot down another one. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't been looking at the screens. You can see for yourself. He plugged the memory crystal into the socket of Sven's computer. I cut out a few minutes from the drone's launch, leaving only the most interesting, Avi said. This drone was aimed along the river, the one west of the camp. I wanted to fly downstream to see what was going on there, but anyway, you'll see for yourself now. The drone glided over the smooth surface of the calm, narrow river. The drone glided over the smooth surface of the calm, narrow river. The camera captured the sleepy atmosphere of the early forest morning very well. The light haze, the ripples on the water from playing fish schools, and the tiny insects swirling between the leaves of the trees bent low over the river. The operator drove the drone at a slow speed to get a good look at all the details, but nothing interesting happened until the drone dived into a narrow opening between two massive fallen trunks across the riverbed. The image immediately jerked to the side, spinning, and Sven realized with amazement that the drone was caught by the fishing net. It entangled the drone in several layers, and the helpless camera, instead of the usual general plan, could see only the scraps of the surrounding environment. But the thin cord, woven from some plant fiber, and several knots connecting the cells of the net, were perfectly visible in the frame. Sven couldn't see who was holding the net, especially since they were moving quickly through the thicket. But it became clear after a couple of minutes. "It can't be," he said in amazement, looking at the screen. "These are our neighbors, the beavers. We studied them as soon as we arrived. They were ordinary animals. Where did they get nets, weapons, houses?" Of course, the beavers didn't look much like their Earth namesakes. Surveyors dubbed them so because the way of life of these funny six-legged animals was basically the same. They built dams on small rivers, of which there were many in the coastal forests, dug burrows, huts, and steep banks, fed on all sorts of small aquatic animals. And they were no more intelligent than ordinary beavers. But now the image from the camera showed a whole village of several dozen houses, built of reeds and twigs, covered with broad leaves of big trees. Between the houses and in the village's central square were crowded inhabitants, but they no longer looked like ordinary animals. First, their posture had changed from the typical six-legged walk of the planet's fauna to 4 limbs, with the upper limbs now clearly used as hands, making them look like furry centaurs, the size of large dogs. Their fur was noticeably shorter, their snouts, faces, noticeably flatter, and the fingers on their upper paws, hands, much more tenacious and agile. They had no clothes, which was not surprising given the planet's very mild, flat climate, but many wore some sort of harness with bags and pouches, and some had. "Oh shit," Sven blurted out. "So that was who had shot Evgeny." The bows were small, like their owners, but quite skillfully crafted. Nothing really complicated, like the composite Mongolian bows, but it was obvious that they had been crafted with care. They weren't just bent sticks with rope like those of the most primitive tribes. All weapons were personalized, decorated with patterns and colored bindings, and obviously crafted to match to their owner's height. "That's just the beginning," Avi said. "When I came to my senses, I immediately sent another drone down there and tried to keep it higher so they wouldn't get to it with the net. But they had something else up their sleeve." The image on the screen has split into two. One showed trunks and branches from the second drone flying through the thicket toward the village. The other was a broadcast from the captured drone, showing the excited commotion of the villagers, who had obviously heard the buzzing of the approaching machine. A few of those with bows pointed their weapons skyward, putting arrows on the bowstring, but then, with guttural shouts, they put the arrows back in their quivers and rushed to a large building with wide doors, from where a minute later they pulled out a bulky structure that bore some resemblance to their personal weapons and began to draw it. "It's a ballista," Sven exclaimed. "Or a scorpion, or whatever the Romans called it. I don't know much about ancient history." Avi nodded. "Look." Just at that moment, the second drone flew out of the forest and hovered over the village, recording everything happening, but it didn't last long. The crowd of natives roared, and the ballista fired a massive bolt with an obviously metal tip into the sky with a loud crack. The drone operator was obviously a bit confused because he moved the drone aside only at the very last moment, and the projectile tangentially hit its casing, damaging the camera. The image flickered and turned into a jumble of pixels, and a moment later, the camera of the captured drone went out as well. "It looks like it's been trampled or cobbled," Avi commented. "What do you think?" Sven shook his head. "I can't believe my eyes. The village, the bows, the ballista. Where did all this come from? We couldn't have missed that." "We couldn't," Avi said, taking his memory crystal. "But somehow we did. I've launched other scouts a couple of kilometers high so the natives won't notice. So far, they've counted several hundred villages across the continent. They work the land by hand with hoes and graze some native ruminants. The Neolithic Revolution is in full swing," Sven muttered. "I don't get it. It doesn't happen overnight, out of nothing. Homo sapiens took several 100,000 years to get to this point if we take roughly the same starting point, and I flattered us a lot on that. But here, it's like overnight." "Exactly," Avi nodded. "The day before yesterday, we were discussing how we could carefully relocate the beaver colony to set up an additional camp at the mouth of the river, and we sedated a couple of specimens for study. And today, they are no longer specimens, but members of the local population." Sven gave him a sharp glance. "What about the ones that were put to sleep?" he asked. "How are they behaving? Did they suddenly become intelligent?" Avi waved his hands. "Who knows?" he said. "The biologists put them both in the scanner, filmed them completely, and then released them back. Yesterday morning. And Shubin was already shot in the evening," said Sven. "That's an interesting sequence of events." Avi stared at him. As always, the exo-psychologist had a knack for making logical connections where no one would have thought to look for them. "No," Avi said at last. "It can't be. They were just animals. I went to that dam myself when they were released. It can't be. Then what could it be? Sven asked. Do you have any other ideas? But how is it possible? Evolution in 24 hours. I don't know, said Sven, but I'd really like to find out. He looked at the lush green of the subtropical forest outside the perimeter of the base camp. I want to know, and I'm afraid. The next surprise fell upon them a few hours later. By this time, several Aboriginal villages had already been under constant surveillance from orbital and high-atmospheric vehicles. Special attention, of course, was paid to the village closest to the camp, which was being monitored by several drones and satellites at once. But much to the disappointment of Sven, Avi, and the other surveyors, nothing much was happening anywhere. The natives lived a typical late Neolithic life. They cultivated vegetable gardens, herded domesticated animals, and in a few villages there were pottery and even copper workshops. If not for the fact that all of this had appeared with the wave of a magic wand in just 24 hours, the planet would have been no different from hundreds of similar ones, where the locals were just beginning to develop. Sven even remembered that he had heard of several species that were anatomically similar to beavers, that is, had 6 limbs and followed the centaur's pattern. Leaving the camp and contacting the natives was forbidden. The federal authorities also strictly monitored the safety of the primitive tribes and severely punished any unauthorized contact attempts. Sven and Avi decided that until it was clear what was happening on the planet, it was better not to take any risky steps. However, the next step was not taken by humans. The duty officer who burst into Sven's working dome looked like he was about to evolve 1,000,000 years in a few minutes himself. "They're gone," he blurted out in response to Avi and Sven's questioning looks. "Who's gone?" Sven calmly clarified. "The natives, all those villages, fields, fairs. There's nothing, like there never was." Avi's first thought was that the guy had fallen asleep at the console and confused something he'd dreamed with reality. But after clicking through the surveillance channels, he realized that was the case. It was a question of who was dreaming what, Avi thought, but pushed it away. How could all 38 people in the camp have seen the same synchronized hallucination? Was the arrow that had taken Shubin's eye away a hallucination too? "Interesting," said Sven. "The situation seems to be developing even faster than I thought." "Interesting?" Avi couldn't take it anymore. "He's interested, you see. The situation is developing, you see. Can someone explain what the hell is going on here? What do we do? Stand up and march to the psychiatrist?" Sven sighed, looking sympathetically at the completely distraught duty officer. "No," he said. "I suppose not. If this is what I think it is, then we need to break camp and get off this planet as soon as possible." Avi stared at him blankly. "What do you mean, get off? How soon?" Sven smiled. "Right now would be best, but I think we'll have to wait until the next notice to convince Hansen." "From who?" Sven nodded towards the forest. "From the locals, of course." Avi entered the ship's recreation and, with a sigh of relief, sank down on the comfortable, soft couch. Sven greeted him with a nod and held out a glass of tonic. "So, how is Hansen?" he asked. "Roaring all over the place?" Avi remembered the conversation with the chief and felt a slight twitch. "Not anymore." He thanked Sven with a nod and sipped his tonic. The cool liquid pleasantly refreshed his parched mouth. He'd yelled at first, of course. Not surprisingly, a great project like this had gone wrong. But this case had gone into circles that even Hansen couldn't handle. "Your report to patrol seems to have made a lot of noise. According to Hansen, it's got the whole place in a tizzy." Sven looked very seriously straight in the Avi's eyes. "I hope they are as scared as I am. The case is indeed very serious, the likes of which we have never encountered before. Even comparing to that artifact you discovered on Agasphere? Sven shook his head. Well, first of all, I'm not the only one who discovered it. And secondly, we have no influence on the artifact at all. All we can do is stay away from it and hope we haven't triggered some incredible universal mechanism of the Precursors. The natives of Paradise Planet are a different matter. Here, we can have an impact, or rather, we already have. Avi poured himself more tonic from the crystal decanter. Maybe you can finally tell me exactly what happened there. Of course, when the first cannonballs and musket bullets hit the protective power field around the camp, it became crystal clear to everyone that it was time to run. But what the hell was that all about? I feel like everybody knows but me. You know, Patrol knows, Hansen knows. I still haven't figured out what's going on. I'm sorry. I should have explained it to you right away. But in the hustle and bustle of packing, I didn't have time for that. And then you dropped dead asleep until Hansen called you over the hyperlink. Sven raised his eyes dreamily to the ceiling. Damn, how much money your boss has. I can't even imagine how much a direct hyperlink session across several hundred light years costs. If I hadn't used the protocol ZX0, my report to Patrol would have been waiting at least another week. What's that protocol? Avi couldn't resist, though eager to learn everything about Paradise Planet. It's a patrol instruction that gives absolute priority to information critical to humanity's survival, Sven said. Avi smiled uncertainly, but the exo-psychologist was completely serious. Wait, you're not kidding? Sven shook his head. It's no time for jokes. In fact, we're lucky I still have access to the patrol's codes. The last time the protocol was used was on Agasphere. Avi stared at his friend, stunned. No, I understand that these guys on Paradise Planet are something special, but for God's sake, a threat to humanity in the form of an army from the Napoleonic Wars? And if I remind you that they got to this army from a state of pre-intelligent animals in 2 days of real time? That's what I don't understand, Avi said, confused. How did they manage to do such a trick, and why is that a threat to us? The fact that they did it with such ease is the biggest threat. You see, unlike most of humanity, for whom what happened on Agasphere is still obscure news from some half-mythical corner of the galaxy, I've experienced time manipulation firsthand, and I know for a fact that it's possible. I believe that the native inhabitants of Paradise Planet are able to go back in time or create some kind of closed time pockets within which they experience enough years to evolve biologically and then follow the path of scientific, technological, and historical development. They're time travelers, Sven shrugged. I don't know for sure, I'm not a physicist after all, but they do something with time, and those possibilities really scare me. Avi twirled his glass in his hands, puzzled. Wait, but they've lived on their wonderful planet for God knows how many years, not rushing to evolve anywhere and racing through time back and forth like kids on gravity surfing. Sven looked at him reproachfully. Avi, you're a xenobiologist, even if you haven't worked in your specialty for a day. It's very simple. Remind me why our distant ancestors went on the great quest of evolution and became Homo sapiens. But, for example, gorillas and chimpanzees never learned to speak and write, although their brains are quite capable of it, as thousands of experiments have shown. Because the environmental conditions of our ancestors began to change dramatically, and they had to adapt, and gorillas and chimpanzees lived in their jungles, to which they were already perfectly adapted and continued to live there. It's the basics. Avi stopped abruptly, realizing where the exo-psychologist was going. Shit. Well, you finally figured it out, Sven nodded. We didn't call the planet Paradise for nothing. It's a very comfortable place to live. They lived there. They used their chrono abilities only to catch fish more efficiently and move their huts before the rainy season so they wouldn't get flooded. And then we came along and started changing their environment. We kidnapped them, wandered right around their dwellings, made noise, and scooped water out of the dam. Hell, I think the guys even went fishing in that river. And then they were also attacked by strange flying objects. I think they thought they were demons then. And they began to actively accelerate their time loops to adapt. It was during these accelerations that we lost sight of them. Sven sipped his tonic and set his glass on the table. I just hope they'll relax a little after we leave. The patrol will, of course, quarantine the planet. But it's a question of who the quarantine will protect. The natives of Paradise Planet, or all the galaxy civilizations from them. Avi was slowly trying to comprehend what he had heard. Oh my God. They jumped millions of years of evolution in literally a day of our time. And then another 10 to 20,000 years or so in a matter of hours. If we keep poking them with a stick, it's scary to even think who or what they could become in a few years. Sven shook his head. That's half the trouble. What if this ability to enter protective evolutionary cycles is inherent in not only our Centauro beaver friends, but also other living organisms on Paradise Planet? Avi's jaw dropped. When we left, the natives had already developed industry and steam engines, Sven said. We know very well how industry affects the environment, especially at the beginning of the scientific and technological revolution. What if the entire biosphere of Paradise Planet starts an evolutionary leap under the influence of the first generation? Avi swallowed. Then we'd probably end up in quarantine ourselves. He thought for a moment. I hope they don't decide to turn our galaxy into an elite fishing resort.